The thing which we probably forget to say about medieval sword scabbards is they probably fell apart quite a lot. Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now, as you know, I study edged weapons and armour from a wide period of time across the world. And this means that sometimes I'm studying one particular aspect of arms and armour, and it gives me a fresh insight into another period and another geography and another area. So, we often talk on this channel about medieval weapons, particularly those associated with knights and people like that. And here we've got this is actually from the second batch upcoming. This is a prototype from the Royal Armouries line that I've been working on with Windlass and the Royal Armouries. And these obviously have wooden scabbards. Now, for anybody who doesn't know, and I'm sure most of you watching this channel do know, throughout the medieval period, the standard type of scabbard that was housing swords and that swords were worn in were wood-lined, leather-covered scabbards. Now, if you look at a lot of kind of cheap modern replicas, or indeed certain reenactment swords, for various reasons they're often put in plain leather scabbards because they're easier to wear, they're cheaper to make, these kinds of reasons. However, historically in the medieval period, certainly if we're going from the Roman era, in fact pre-Roman era, Iron Age, all the way through Roman, early medieval, high medieval, late medieval, and into the beginning of the Renaissance, almost all scabbards in Europe were made of wood with leather over the top. Now, this has a number of advantages. Firstly, it's relatively light, but it's also relatively strong. It protects the blade, it keeps the weather out. Because it's fairly rigid, the wood, it helps keep you safe and other people around you safe from the points and the edges of the sharp sword. And of course they have fittings on like this chape here, and sometimes they have locket plates up at the top as well. So these keep you and other people around you safe from the sword, but they also keep the sword safe from the elements, water, rain, this kind of stuff. And of course they make it easier to wear. But moreover, because they are wooden, they also, to some degree, protect the edges and keep the edges sharp, which means that when you do need to draw the sword out and use it, it is ready to use and it's not being dulled by the scabbard. Now, I mentioned I study other periods, and obviously one of the periods I study a lot and I deal in antiques of is the 19th century, 18th and 19th centuries. Now, you will notice if you look on my antique website or anywhere on the internet really, or a lot of my videos, you'll notice that in the 19th century, iron or steel scabbards were very, very popular. Now, the question is why? Firstly, and the question is really durability. Now, there are a number of sources discussing this. In fact, there was even discussions in Parliament, in British Parliament, about this in the 19th century, about whether the cavalry should be equipped with wooden and leather scabbards, much like the old medieval ones, as the troops in India had with their tulwars, because this meant that the sword blades were kept sharp because they weren't dulled by the steel scabbards. Now, one of the problems with steel scabbards is they are more likely to lead to a blunting of the edge. So if you're on an active campaign in the Napoleonic Wars or the Crimean War, Franco-Prussian War, whatever, if you're continually drawing and sheathing your sword into a metallic scabbard, the action between the edge and the throat can very quickly blunt the edge, which means that when you need the sword to be sharp and effective, it's not going to be. Now, in fact, the arms designers of the day found workarounds to this to keep the steel scabbards, but they put wood and or leather liners inside of here, which meant that essentially the sword blade itself is in contact with wood or leather instead of steel. There's still often a slight problem in drawing them. They do come into contact with that metal throat, and to that end, certain officers' swords, the metallic throat up there, instead of using iron or steel, they use a softer metal, so-called German silver, which is sort of like a nickel alloy, a little bit like pewter. Which means that it's much softer than the edge. So although it will have slight dulling effect on the edge as it goes past, if it touches, it won't have anywhere near as much as if the scabbard that was in contact, or the throat that was in contact with the edge, was made of iron or steel. So, to cut a long story short, they decided to make this sacrifice of the fact that these scabbards did tend to have problems with blunting swords. They even went to the effort of installing liners, wood or leather liners, inside the steel scabbards. Why did they go to all that effort just to retain these steel scabbards? Why didn't they all just move to wood and leather scabbards? And they did sometimes towards the end of the 19th century. The so-called field service scabbard came in, particularly in British service, inspired by Indian swords. So it was adopted towards the end of the 19th century. Really from about the 1870s and 1880s onwards, it became quite common for field service scabbards to be made of wood and leather. But in most of Europe, in France and Germany, for example, Prussia, and most of the rest of Europe, steel scabbards were retained. And that was purely because of durability. Now, you might think, why were they so obsessed with scabbard durability? Well, from a pure basic point of view, walking around with a scabbard, it will bash on things, it will get damaged, the wood might break, the leather will get torn. When these are mounted on the horses rather than actually on the men themselves, they jangle around, bash around, they hit stirrups and spurs and bits of the horse equipment, and even each other and other horses, and so they do get very easily broken. Now, it was noticed that in the Indian army, where wood and leather scabbards were used for Indian tulwars, that the scabbards were continually having to be replaced. Remember that, because we're going to come back to that point in a second. The British government and many other governments around Europe did not want the cost and the expense of continually replacing scabbards. Scabbards have to be fitted to blades. They're not actually particularly simple things to make. And they didn't want any of that, so they stuck with steel scabbards. So even though there were big drawbacks to having steel scabbards, they stuck with them basically as a long-term cost-cutting measure, because although they cost more to make at the beginning, they lasted basically forever, and of course they protected the blade better than the wooden one did. So if you did happen to fall off your horse or bang against a wall, the blade of the sword, and the sword was much more expensive than the scabbard, was protected better in a steel scabbard than in a wood and leather one. Now, at this juncture, I just want to throw in, a lot of people, particularly medievalists who love these sorts of swords and don't love the 19th century swords, have a tendency of going, oh, stupid Victorians, they knew nothing. And of course, this is an overreaction, and it's sometimes replacing Victorian myths with modern myths that tell lies about the Victorians. The fact is, there were good reasons for having steel scabbards, and they weren't the first ones to have metallic scabbards. In fact, if we look back in history, we actually find similar solutions come to in other parts of the world and other time periods as well. And in fact, we can find Iron Age swords with iron blades in bronze scabbards. So we do actually find metallic scabbards all the way back in the Iron Age, and certain Roman swords, sometimes their scabbards, although they were wood on the inside, were so clad in metal that they become almost like metal scabbards. And in fact, there's another example. If we go to the Middle Eastern and the Asian worlds, if we look at certain swords which were carried by cavalry, so this is the LK Chen Mongolian sabre, and although it is a wood and leather covered scabbard, functionally, you will notice that it is clad in iron. It's got iron all the way around here, all around the outside edges, with iron bands around here. And this is quite similar to Mamluk cavalry scabbards and a whole bunch of other scabbards that we find across a swathe of Europe. And in fact, even if we look at the migration era, if we look at certain fittings and mounts on certain scabbards there, although in essence they are wood and leather scabbards, they have a lot of metallic mountings on them. Why? For durability. So it was for the exact same reason. Okay, so either putting lots of metallic fittings on a wooden leather scabbard or making an entirely metal scabbard is a way of having a durable scabbard which is not going to get easily destroyed, and that is particularly important when we look at cavalry swords. And of course, remember that things like the people like the Mongols were quite concerned with how durable their scabbards were. They might be campaigning far from their bases, as the Mongols did. If you've got wide-ranging cavalry campaigns and these swords are being bashed around on horseback, where they get much more abused than most people walking on foot do, miles away from home where you can repair them easily, it's important that you have scabbards that stay together. And don't belittle the importance of a scabbard. Everybody fixates on the sword, but if you don't have an easy way of wearing it and carrying it and being able to, you know, protect the sword and also being able to draw it quickly and access it when you need it, the scabbard as part of the weapon system is pretty much as important as the sword itself. So hopefully it's now clear to you that both medieval Asian swords and later 19th century, 18th and 19th century European swords took scabbard durability very, very seriously. So let's bring this back to medieval swords. Why, therefore, did medieval people not bother that much about the durability of their scabbards? And the question, the answer is I don't exactly know, because actually medieval knightly swords were subjected to just as much abuse as Mongolian swords in the 13th century, or you know, French and German and Italian military sabres in the 19th century. They went on long campaigns, they went far away from their bases, they were carried on foot and on horseback. Moreover, within a medieval context, we're dealing with a lot of armour as well. And the very act, anyone who's done reenactment, living history, the very act of wearing these scabbards in that environment means they get damaged. Okay, now if you're an author of books, or you make role-playing games, or even video games, then this is important information to know. Wood and leather scabbards, whether it's people in 18th century Rajput India, or whether it's a medieval knight in the 14th century in France, scabbards get destroyed. They are consumables. Okay, unlike a sword, which hopefully will last years at least, possibly decades, and sometimes even hundreds of years, scabbards just can't, except for when they're collected and put into an armoury or an arsenal or a museum. If they are used and if they're worn and they're carried, scabbards will get destroyed. Purely anecdotal, modern, any reenactor will tell you, anyone who's ever had a wood-lined scabbard, and remember I mentioned a lot of reenactors just use plain leather scabbards, I have done myself as well. The reason is that wooden scabbards easily get fallen on, things dropped on them, or trodden on, or accidentally caught in doorways and round chairs and things like this, and they break. The simple fact is that unless you make an incredibly heavy wooden scabbard, which you don't want to do because you don't want to wear it, if you make an authentically, relatively slim piece of wood, it's not a heavy object, it's fairly light. It's enough there to protect you and protect the blade, but fundamentally, if I stand on this, it will break, okay? So, they are consumables, they are disposable. Therefore, if you're looking at recreating the medieval world, either in art or, you know, like paintings, or indeed in games, or indeed as a living history or reenactor person, then you should expect scabbards to show wear and tear, even quite high status ones, because they get damaged really quickly and really easily, so bear that in mind. But the last thing I want to say is, why did medieval people not go for metal scabbards and did not sort of armour or enhance their scabbards with cladding, essentially, like the Mongols and the Chinese and various other people did? Why didn't they do that? We literally have just wood, leather stitched over the top, usually no locket in the earlier period, and just a chape at the end. And I think the answer has to be that they were mass-produced scabbards, they were disposable, if they broke, you got a new one, and it was as simple as that. And we see a similar attitude to medieval shoes, for example. Shoes were patched and were repaired, but for the most part, shoes seem to have been treated in the medieval world as disposable objects and replaceable, not particularly expensive, and there was a big industry in manufacturing them. So there we go. I hope that's been somewhat interesting, kind of whistle-stop tour of the types of scabbards that were being used around the world at different times, but also the different considerations and attitudes to them. Where you've got a government in the 19th century trying to save money, you'll get metal scabbards because they last a long time and protect the swords. Where you've got a knight, for example, or even an archer in the 15th, 14th centuries, they might see a scabbard much like a pair of shoes. You use them until they wear out, and then you get a new one, and you don't have to be too precious about it. Anyway, I hope that's been somewhat interesting and thought-provoking. If you think there's other things I should have covered or things I forgot to mention, or if you just massively disagree with me, that's cool as well. I hope to see those kind of comments down there in the comment section down below. I have been Matt Easton, I will continue to be, and I hope to see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks!
Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.